Hey guys, it's Jacob with TCG Time Capsule, and this is it, the big one. Some of you have been following the progress of this video for weeks on our Discord, and you know just how much time and effort has been put into this one by myself and the rest of the TCG Buzz crew. Shoutouts to Dalton and Speed Robo for their consulting on the script, my girlfriend Megan for some very spicy memes, Brody for dealing with my terrible grammar, and to our editor Micaiah for dealing with all my last minute changes and insisting she squeeze in just one more meme. Say hi, Micaiah. This video was inspired by a late night realization I had. I've been passionate about preserving the quickly disappearing history of trading card games for a long time, hence why TCG Time Capsule exists in the first place. But I realized something big was missing. I've referenced different eras and events in card game history, but I've never made a definitive list of all the going-ons for all card games in the now approaching 4 decades of their history. I then went on a hunt to see if anyone has ever made an actual timeline of the TCG industry. And no, they really haven't. Sources for anything related to card games can be quite hard to find. And those I did find were either incredibly narrow, like just focusing on the history of one game, mostly Magic, or they were very unreliable and had a lot of missing info. I've spent more time researching for this project than any other project I've ever worked on. I scoured old web forums, I looked through every remotely helpful Wikipedia source, I paid for access to market research, I read books for you. I hope you guys appreciate just how many hours went into researching card games that I could have spent actually playing card games. I did find one timeline of sorts that tried to list out the eras of card games, but I found it lacking in quality. Not only does it argue that the past 14 years of gaming all constitute one single era, but it also lists Avatar: The Last Airbender as an anime, so I don't think we can trust it. It's such a shame there is so little out there about the history of one of the most interesting and creative art forms there is. Creating a card game is really hard work, and I hate to think of the people who worked hard making one only for it to be completely forgotten. That said, if you like what I'm doing here and want to support me as I continue documenting card game history, here's a link to our Patreon. Oh, and before we get into it, as a side note, I use the phrase trading card games to represent the entire industry. Some of you will be more comfortable with the term collectible card games, or CCG. Generally, the terms are interchangeable, but CCG was more often used in the early day of card games, and TCG has become more common as time has progressed. We'll be going over all 4 decades of trading card goodness and splitting them into different eras chronologically. We are going to start with the creation of the first TCG, Magic the Gathering, brushing past the history of cigar cards, sports cards, and collectible cards, or this would be a 2-hour video. Also, it's been argued that Top Trumps is the actual first trading card game, and that is a totally valid argument, but that is a debate for a whole nother time. Also, I'm primarily focusing on the North American card market because 1, it has the most clear-cut eras, 2, it's where trading card games started, and 3, that's where I live, so deal with it. Oh, and one more note before we get into it. You'll notice that the years stated for each era will bleed into others. As humans, we tend to want to give things distinct cutoff points, but the real world is rarely so black and white that several years on this list will fall into multiple eras as one era transitions to another. Let's go. Our first era is the easiest to pin down because at the start, the industry was literally just Magic the Gathering. As the first real collectible game, there were plenty of elements to early Magic that are hilariously archaic in hindsight. But that chaotic mess was something beautiful. A lot of elements of card games we take for granted wouldn't be added to Magic until it was already established for a couple of years, like set symbols, publicized card rarities, limits to how many of each card you can have in your deck, and so much more. Magic was created by Dr. Richard C. Garfield, PhD, a professor of mathematics at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. Things will be very simplified here, since I'd like to do a full video on Richard Garfield's life in the future, but TLDR. Richard Garfield is a genius, and he is completely deserving of the godlike treatment displayed on his Magic the Gathering card. The man's truly something special. Garfield created Magic with friends as a sort of funding scheme to fund the development of more expensive tabletop games. Magic, originally called Mana Clash, was designed to be cheap to produce, requiring just a deck of cards to play and nothing else. The game was then picked up by Garfield's friends at a budding company, Wizards of the Coast, and would become far more successful than anyone involved could have possibly imagined. With Magic the Gathering proving to be a smash hit far beyond Wizards of the Coast's expectations, they looked to expand their offerings. This era would see WotC release several new games that would all come to be known as cult classics long after their discontinuation, like Jihad and Netrunner. At the same time, you had a lot of other companies throw their hats into the ring. Many of these companies came from the pen and paper world, like TSR, the creators of Dungeons & Dragons, and Steve Jackson Games. If I had to use one word to describe this era, it would be dark. Most of your new games would take the Tolkien-inspired aesthetic of early Magic and take it to darker places. The most common themes in card games were gothic horror, conspiracy, and violence. This really reflects the demographics of card game players at the time, who were almost entirely male nerds in their 20s to 30s, in which many players came from Dungeons & Dragons, looking for something casual to play after an intense session fighting, say, a Terraskew. This is also reflected in the places you would find card games for sale. Primarily, card games were sold in comic book stores, hobby shops, and mail order through magazines. The past few years saw crazy growth for the still really new CCG market. That changes here. First, we have to look at Magic, since it still represented the majority of the card game industry on its own. Magic had consistently seen a decline in sales since late 1994 due to some pretty lackluster sets like Fallen Empires and Homelands, which is generally considered the worst Magic set of all time. When the sets were good, like the Urza's trilogy, they had the opposite problem, being so broken that the game was completely warped around them, causing some tension with players. All this would lead Magic into a sort of dark age. Sales would drop, sure, but more importantly, Magic's relevance and influence would be at an all-time low, and would take several years for Magic to recover. While Magic was in an interesting place, Wizards of the Coast in general was doing very well. Their newer titles like Netrunner continued to be strong, and they would release a ton of new card games during this era, including the first ever cross-IP system. By this point, WotC essentially had a monopoly on the card game industry. Many of your companies who had got into the last era had already shut their doors. And a good 70 to 80% of all new card games in this era were published by Wizards of the Coast. They also used their newfound fortune to buy everything in sight. They went out and bought TSR, the publishers of Dungeons & Dragons, which also gave them full control of Gen Con. Then they bought Five Rings Publishing Group. You may know them for Legends of the Five Rings. They then went on to buy Andon Limited, which would give them access to Origin, Gen Con's primary competition. They then tried to complete their stranglehold on the market by filing a rather broad patent for the invention of the trading card game, and ordering all other publishers to pay them royalties. This ultimately didn't go very far, since Wizards was actually afraid to enforce their patent in case a judge ruled it invalid. This largely curbed many of WotC's monopolistic urges, alongside threats from legal action from Decipher, who was at this point the second biggest card game company due to riding the massive Star Wars revival with their Star Wars card game. 90s Wizards did not mess around, but even with their stranglehold on the industry, they were unable to stop the general decline of the entire industry. Now, looking back with hindsight, it was pretty obvious it was their fault to begin with. After several years of decline for the industry, it received a real shot of adrenaline thanks to the release of the Pokémon trading card game. Although it came out in Japan in 1996, it would take till 1999 for the Pokémon craze to take place stateside. Wizards of the Coast licensed the Pokémon card game for distribution and used their expertise with card game publishing to make the game nothing less than a craze. You would then see the release of the Dragon Ball Z card game by Square Entertainment in 2000, and the release of the Yu-Gi-Oh card game in 2002. These three games, and the continued success of Magic, would cause many new card game specific stores to open around the country that would host tournaments, creating a boom for competitive play. Although this era attracted new players of all ages, it particularly did well with children. The news was filled with stories of schools banning all cards due to fights and theft being in the commonplace. I personally remember my second grade teacher confiscating all of my Yu-Gi-Oh cards. I never did get them back. Another major shift from this era was the widespread acceptance of card games from retail stores. Before this era, you usually only found trading cards at hobby shops, comic book stores, and book chains like Borders. But now stores like Walmart, Kmart, and KB Toys needed to get in on that action for some sweet profits. And they are one of the most common places cards are bought at to this day. Well, the ones that still exist anyways. With Pokemon and the like revitalizing the industry, you saw a new breed of copycats. This era is filled with anime card games. While some were masterpieces like Duel Masters, most new card games from this era were bad. Many card games were just released as quick cash grabs or marketing tools for their parent IPs. If I made a list of the worst card games of all time, I'd bet at least half of them would come from this era. The majority of games would be released with a big marketing push to get those impulsive kid sales, and then would be dead within under a year. I've previously compared this era to the US video game crash of 1983, and I absolutely stand by that. This is the era where many of your original game stores that had been carrying card games from the very beginning would shut their doors for good. There was so much risk involved with covering basically any new card game to come out in this era. By the later years of this era, the bubble burst and very few card games survived. We went from years where you would see dozens of new card games to only a few releases per year. Another major notable event from this era was a major revamp to Magic the Gathering's aesthetics. With the release of 8th edition, celebrating Magic's 10th anniversary, the game would see a drastic shift in its overall card frame design, font used, and clarity of text over backgrounds. Many players were happy to see Magic look like a modern card game, but many others felt the game lost much of its flavor. Well, I mentioned in the last era that the bubble burst for card games somewhere around 2006. Well, things were only going to get worse. You see, we kind of had this massive financial disaster that would lead to the worst economic decline since the Great Depression. And when things get that bad, one of the first things to go are entertainment and luxury expenses. Card games are both of those things. Sales for the industry tanked. Even the big card games saw massive drops in sales and were forced to innovate to stay in the green with new additions like Synchro Summoning, Level X cards, and Magic's new Mythic rarity and Planeswalkers. By this point, pretty much every card game on the market that was niche or less popular was shut down. New games were few and far between because companies weren't willing to invest in such shaky times. Those that did release, like Chaotic, would struggle their entire lifetime. It goes without mention that many more local card game stores would shut down in this period. You would also see some stores convert to an online storefront to try and pull in a larger network of customers. This era is actually the hardest to talk about because, nothing happened. With the recovery of the economy being slow, very few new games were being released. Things were better than a few years ago, but in order for card-based games to succeed, they had to rely on gimmicks like incorporating toys or riding nostalgia for games from previous eras. With the exception of BAKUGAN, which only barely counts, none of the games from this era would have any staying power. When was the last time you thought of Huntix or Redakai? Yeah, I thought so. This era also coincides with many of those kids who grew up in the craze era of 1999 through 2001, growing out of card games. Some of them ended up like me, being passionate about card games forever, but many either quit entirely or stuck to playing one game for the rest of their card game lives, not experimenting with new, fresh ideas. This era definitely bleeds into the previous one quite a bit, but there are some distinct differences. This era would see the economy slowly recover, and that would have some interesting effects. I see three notable events from this era. 1. We saw the rise of a new game publisher, Bushiroad. This Japanese company would launch several popular card games in this era, like Cardfight Vanguard, Y Schwartz, and Future Card Buddy Fight. They would never be quite popular enough to usurp the top 3 games, but they would be consistently successful regardless. 2. The mass opening of new game stores. Many of the people who grew up playing card games in the 90s were now old enough and financially independent enough to make their dreams come true by opening their own card stores. My personal LGS, Frost Giant Games, is a great example of this. 3rd is the rise of repack companies, the most famous, or rather infamous, of them being MJ Holdings. These companies would become very successful by buying up overstocked products from major publishers and reselling them in mystery boxes, and by being as shady as possible along the way. This era is all about the rise of digital card games, which is why it completely overlaps with the other 2 eras. This era definitely starts with the release of Hearthstone, Blizzard's digital card game that would top Twitch charts for years, and that's another thing. This era is where you really see the rise of influencers for card games on Twitch and YouTube. This is also the era that TCG Buzz was started in, not that we're particularly influential. Hearthstone would directly lead to many other successful digital card games like Gwent, Artifact, and Magic Arena. Digital clients for card games had been tried for a long time before this era, but this is where they became mainstream. This era can be identified by just how strong the market was. Many card games did very well, including some new titles like Force of Will and the Dragon Ball Super card game. Competitive event attendance would reach an all-time high for many games. Even those games that didn't quite become huge successes still led card games to new and unique places. A great example of that would be Lightseekers. There was a general pushback to the norms of card games at this time, alongside a general level of competence in game design not seen before, with new types of resource engines like Chrono Clash's time system or Buddy Fight's gauge system. Another big thing this era would be the explosion in investing in card games. Things went insane, beginning with the financial world taking notice of the money to be made in Magic the Gathering, particularly in the reserve list. After that, you would also see explosions in the value of old school Pokémon and Yugioh. That binder of old cards in your closet might actually be worth something now. Well, here we are, current day. I'm sure I don't have to tell you this, but 2020 was a bad year for card games. If you really need me to elaborate on that, I made an entire video covering it. However, I will note that events in 2019 and early 2020 weren't particularly good for the industry either. Continued issues with various international trade wars increased many games' prices, as well as an overall increase in monetization strategies from major card games. Investing in and collecting trading cards had been a thing long before this era, but this is the era where the companies behind the games took notice and began to exploit it for their own benefit. This has been a tough era for card games, with pretty much every competitive event shut down, and many card games reaching their end. I obviously can't tell the future, but I personally feel optimistic for where card games are headed in the future. You guys watching this video from that future will know if I was right to be optimistic or not, but I don't have future sight yet. That's all right for you guys in this interesting video. It's a little different for the typical TCG Time Capsule format. Don't worry, we're going to be going back to reviewing specific dead card games soon. So you want to make sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. And this video took a ton of work, a ton of man hours. So if you'd like to support us financially, there's our Patreon, or you can use our TCG Player affiliate link and buy some cards, and you'll indirectly be supporting us through there. And of course, if you'd like to discuss this or any other topic with us, you can join our Discord. And I'll see you guys next time.